Welcome back everybody, my name is Nick930 and this is a retrospective look at the Star Wars Battlefront series. I wanted to take a look back at what the original games really were like because I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions out there mixed in with the bad sentiment for the most recent EA version of the series, and I'd like to clear things up and see what really made those games so popular in the first place. The original Battlefront from 2004 featured a full campaign that actually walked you through the major battles that had been shown on screen at the time, and even some battles that had not yet been fully imagined, like Kashyyyk. Players could participate in the battle on Naboo as a droid and fight the Gungans, and then they would eventually fight alongside the clone soldiers on Geonosis against the droids themselves. But it's important to keep in mind that these missions, while part of the single-player storyline, were pretty shallow. All they really were repurposed multiplayer maps with basic bot AI thrown in with a few modifiers like the Gungans. The Gungans weren't even playable online. There never really were objectives aside from the basic conquest game mode that Pandemic Studios potentially stole straight from the Battlefield franchise. There were occasionally optional objectives like trying to destroy the shield generators on these gigantic Fombas creatures, but I never found that they really made any difference in the outcome of the match, and you focusing on destroying them often led to you losing the match and having to restart it just to progress to the next level. If anything, the campaign to the original Battlefront was just a way to showcase the different maps and remind you where they all came from. The game even shows clips from the movies right before the battles in case you weren't sure. In addition to the game's main story campaign, you could also play in a mode called Galactic Conquest, which basically offered a custom Battlefront campaign where your victories and defeats would directly affect the next battle in terms of reinforcements, location, vehicles, and other assets like Jedis arriving to help you out. This was a fun mode, and I loved playing it offline with my friends, and trying to fight for control over planets in a sort of tug-of-war that could last hours was just a lot of fun. If you weren't interested in spending hours with the game, then you could also jump right into the action with Instant Action, a mode that let you choose whichever map you wanted to play and allowed you to choose between the different Star Wars eras. The game's many modes were designed with single player in mind, and it truly felt like a Star Wars sandbox with all the most epic moments from the series available for you to play. Now, Pandemic's Battlefront II aimed to expand upon the campaign mode and offered a storyline based on the perspective of a clone soldier that lived through the Clone Wars and the events of the original trilogy. Once again, the campaign had you play through multiplayer maps against AI enemies, but this time the game offered more distinct objectives. You were often tasked with destroying key components, or executing Order 66 and killing all the Jedi at the Jedi Temple. Because of the game's release coinciding with the release of Revenge of the Sith, the game featured a large collection of maps from that film and almost felt like a big advertisement for it. Even locations that were only shown for a few seconds in the film, like Felucia, were made into multiplayer maps to help expand on the game's already impressive list of levels. Now, one of the biggest complaints I hear time and time again about the newest Battlefront is that it lacks a single-player story campaign, despite the other games not really having their own campaign either. Now, this is true, and it is a shame that the 2015 game didn't include a fleshed-out campaign, but it did include single-player missions in the form of tutorials for some of the vehicles that the game let you fly, like the X-Wings through a canyon, air speeders at the Battle of Hoth, and speeder bikes through the Forest of Endor. These missions were fun, but they weren't really anything you would go back and play again. I really felt like they were demos for something bigger. You could also participate in battles, which allowed you to play as a hero or a normal soldier in some of the smaller maps against AI, but unfortunately the more large and epic game modes like Walker Assault and Supremacy were made exclusively for online play. Eventually, DICE added the ability to play through the game's vanilla Walker Assault maps like Endor and Hoth with AI bots in a mode called Skirmish, but this mode didn't allow players to progress their online character in any way, and at first, it didn't even give you access to your own custom loadouts. You could choose from every gun in the game, but it didn't give you any choice of star cards. They eventually patched this and let you play with your own online loadout, but again, this Skirmish mode only let you play a small portion of the game offline with bots. It's a real shame the game's DLC content like Jabba's Palace, the Death Star, and Rogue One were not made available in this mode. Battlefront 2 aims to fix the problems that so many fans had with the first EA game, and has a full and completely original story campaign that we've never really seen in the franchise before. You'll play as an Imperial Special Forces squad, and will fight to avenge Emperor Palpatine after the events of Return of the Jedi, and it appears the story will help to set up the events of The Force Awakens to some extent. It's looking very promising right now, and I hope they do this right because we rarely get unique Star Wars story experiences in video games that are actually good. Now, let's take a moment to talk about the gameplay between all these games. The Battlefront games have never really been much for creative gameplay, and their biggest alluring factor would be the fact that you can play out your Star Wars fantasies and be part of the major battles from those movies. Each game has featured a choice of first or third person shooter gameplay with very basic mechanics and little in the form of customization or tactical gameplay. The original game let you choose between several classes that all offered different weapon types and cosmetic appearances to help them stand out. Some of the classes were pretty straightforward, like the snipers and the basic soldier classes with standard blaster rifles, while others were unique to the Star Wars universe, like the droidicas that could roll onto the battlefield in a vulnerable state, but could deploy with a round shield that could protect it as it fired twin cannons at enemies. Oddly enough, the original Battlefront game had no way to crouch, despite the option being present in the control menu, but you can roll from side to side and even lay down prone. Players had health bars in the original Battlefront that could be replenished by medical droids or friendly players with health packs. Ammo was also limited in the original Battlefront, and players needed to reload their weapon just like real weapons. Ammo gonk droids could be used to refill ammo as well as friendly ammo packs. Players also had access to repair tools that could help repair friendly vehicles. There was no form of customization or unlocks in the original Battlefront, and really the only thing you could do was spawn into the field, shoot at the enemies, capture control points, or take control of iconic Star Wars vehicles. Battlefront 2 expanded significantly on the Battlefront franchise and added a few new classes to the mix that could be unlocked temporarily based on the score you earned per match. These classes, like the Shock Trooper, were much more powerful, and skilled players could dominate a match with them. Players could also use Bothan spies to turn invisible, and clone troopers with miniguns to completely own strategic locations. Battlefront 2 also offered players the first opportunity to play as heroes. Heroes were technically in the first Battlefront game, but you could not control them as a player, and they only appeared in specific campaign missions. Battlefront 2, however, awarded skilled players with the option to play as that map's special hero, and were incredibly powerful tools when used correctly. They all had special abilities and a health bar that would slowly drain if they were being shot at or tried to avoid contact with the enemy. Killing an enemy with a hero would increase this health bar, encouraging players to run out and fight rather than hide. Battlefront 2 was also the first game of the franchise to offer players the chance to fly starfighters in space. You could fly starfighters in Battlefront 1, but they were stuck flying over top of infantry-based maps and could never leave orbit. In Battlefront 2, a new game mode challenged players to destroy the enemy team's large destroyer by targeting key components like the life support system or the bridge. If you successfully destroyed this starship, or killed enough starfighters around them, your team would win. You could even fly inside of the enemy starship, disembark from your starfighter, and destroy the components from the inside out. This was an unbelievably cool game mode, and this is one of the biggest things people complained about when it came to the EA Battlefront game. Another mode that I remember spending a lot of time playing in Battlefront 2 was the Hero Hunt mode. Now, this mode was only offered on the Mos Eisley map and allowed you to play with all of the heroes from all the eras in a large duel across the map. This was a great way to goof around with all of the heroes in the game together and settle arguments about what Jedi could beat what Sith Lord. The level itself also played a large assortment of music, including Jedi Rock, that annoying song from the remastered version of Return of the Jedi. This game also featured the Galactic Conquest game mode and refined some of the elements to make it a more fleshed out experience. The EA Battlefront was a fresh start for the franchise, and basically the only thing connecting it to the old games was the fact that you'd be taking part in classic Star Wars battles. The game featured a much deeper combat system with players capable of selecting from a large assortment of Star Wars weapons and gadgets. The game featured no class selection system, but instead let players choose star cards and set up loadouts with different combinations of these star cards. These star cards gave players access to special gadgets and weapons that could be used every so often based on the card's cooldown. Thermal detonators, for example, could be thrown, and then after the cooldown, players were given another one. This system did away with having to monitor your ammunition, and the health and ammo droids from the old games were completely removed from this one. Players also had special star cards that required charges to utilize, and offered unique player abilities like a personal shield that could protect you from most blaster fire. These special star cards could be charged by locating charged tokens scattered around the map. There were also special weapon pickup tokens around the multiplayer maps that allowed players to pick up unique gadgets like the thermal imploder that caused a massive explosion that sounded really cool. These tokens extended from the battle pickups to the ability to play as heroes and vehicles as well. Players would have to find randomly dropped tokens to spawn in as playable heroes like Luke Skywalker or Han Solo. Unlike Battlefront 2, players could choose from any of the game's featured heroes available, even if it did not make sense chronologically. One of the more odd design choices to the EA Battlefront was making it so the vehicles also received the same token treatment. Rather than walking up to a parked vehicle and driving it onto the battlefield, tokens in the middle of the field offered players the chance to respawn instantly inside a vehicle and then move back into the fight. This made for difficult situations where one team dominated the field with starfighters and walkers, while the other team struggled to reach vehicle tokens of their own in the middle of the map. In terms of game modes, EA's Battlefront featured several game modes that were all technically fun to play, but the large collection of game modes split the already very small community significantly, making it very difficult to find matches even after initial release. Today, it's almost impossible to find any match that's not Walker Assault. Walker Assault was definitely the meat of this game though, and offered the largest scale battles in the game. In Walker Assault, Rebel players were tasked with controlling 2 control points in order to bank Y-wing strikes that could damage the incoming Imperial walkers. The Imperial team's job was to shut down the control points and prevent the Y-wing attacks and protect the walker until they reached the end of the map. There were 3 attack phases that would trigger after a short time that gave Rebels the opportunity to deal as much damage as they could to the walkers before the Y-wing strikes ended, and if the Rebels successfully destroyed both walkers, they would win. It was especially satisfying to trip a walker using the airspeeder, but unlike the original Battlefront games, DICE made this mechanic a bit too simple, with a simple balance minigame popping up on the screen when you initiate the tow cable. The other notable game modes include Air Squadron that allowed you to fight high in the sky with starfighters and try to destroy as many enemy vehicles as possible, with bonus points being awarded to teams that could destroy enemy transport vessels. Heroes were made available in this mode as well, but in the form of classic ships like the Millennium Falcon and Slave One, making the EA Battlefront the first game in the franchise to allow you to fly them. Galactic Conquest and even Basic Conquest never made an appearance in this game, which I always thought was pretty curious considering the Basic Conquest game mode was initially DICE's idea in the first place, so why would they not include it in their own version of Battlefront? I think DICE tried a bit too hard to separate this franchise from their Battlefield franchise, which really ended up hurting them in the end. Another major flaw in the EA Battlefront's design was its over-reliance on additional paid content. The game offered a season pass that cost as much as the game itself, that gave players access to more iconic maps and battles like Jabba's Palace, Cloud City, the Death Star, and even content from the new Rogue One film. These maps were excellent additions to the game, and the new Death Star game mode let you fly in the trenches for the very first time in the franchise. But because of the already small player count, you basically never can go and play this content unless you were playing it on the day of release. DICE eventually had someone go in and make a skirmish game mode that let you play some of the base game's maps with AI bots in Walker Assault and Air Squadron, but unfortunately, they never included the DLC maps, like they said they planned on doing. It's a real shame because the map designs for things like Jabba's Palace were excellent and offered great variety for the game. I hope the next Battlefront game features a return of all of these maps, like how Left 4 Dead 2 includes all the levels from the original game. Speaking of maps, let's take a look at all these games and what they actually offered and settle that dispute once and for all. Battlefront 1 featured 13 maps at launch, with Jabba's Palace being added in later through the 1.2 patch. These maps were all playable in Conquest, and there was no form of space battles in the original Battlefront game. Battlefront 2 featured 12 brand new maps, with 6 old maps from the original Battlefront being included, and 3 additional maps being added via a patch only available on the Xbox console. And that's only including the maps that took place on land. Battlefront 2 also featured a collection of 15 space maps that were playable in Campaign, Galactic Conquest, and only 6 of those maps were available to play in instant action. Now the space maps were all basically the same thing. They had different positions for the spaceships and different backgrounds, but they all played out exactly the same way. EA's Battlefront featured 8 planets, each with several maps for various game modes. In total, EA's Battlefront contained 20 maps at launch, with 21 being added through paid downloadable content, and 5 of these being added for free. 5 more being added for free. Now, it's important to note not all of these maps were available across all mode types, but these are technically different maps and designs and therefore should count towards the overall total. That means that this Battlefront, even at launch, almost had as many multiplayer maps to play as the original Battlefront and Battlefront II games. That's pretty impressive considering DICE limited themselves to only original trilogy content. Now, if we were to count only the largest maps that allowed for Walker Assault in the newer EA Battlefront game, the EA Battlefront only offered 9 maps, even with the DLC. The rest of the game's content is made up of smaller maps for lesser played game modes in addition to some air and space battle maps. So when you line them all up, Battlefront 2 does have significantly more maps and a larger overall scope, with each map being playable in Conquest. But it's important to remember that the maps in the original Battlefront games were incredibly simplistic. Most of the maps feature massive open spaces with little cover and incredibly basic texture work. The biggest draw to the franchise has always been the game's reliance on the Star Wars brand. And the series really wouldn't be that successful without that. EA's Battlefront may have had a smaller scope with its focus on the original trilogy content, but the map designs and gameplay choices were still far more advanced. Battlefront 2, if done correctly, could easily be the best Star Wars game we've ever seen if they build upon what they've done with the latest Battlefront and deliver on the promises they're making with the sequel. There's no details on how EA's second Battlefront game will improve in terms of gameplay, but the trailer does showcase prequel-based content, and the interviews with developers suggest that things like the token system for vehicles and heroes will be adjusted significantly because they realize that it just didn't work. So far, it's looking good, and the inclusion of a single-player campaign and the confirmation that there is no season pass are all good signs. And that's my look at the Battlefront franchise so far. I hope you guys enjoyed this look back, and feel free to leave comments if there's anything you felt I made a mistake on, or if you had any questions. If you want to see more from me, be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.